to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. Hello, my name is Brian Strait, Editor in Chief of Supply Chain Management Review, and this is Talking Supply Chain. Thank you for joining us today. Environmental, social, and governance, or ESG as it's more commonly known, has become a hot topic among businesses for several years now. But it's been seemed to be running into some obstacles lately. To be more clear, ESG typically refers to things such as carbon footprint and sustainability. That's the E part of the ESG. The S applies to social elements such as how operational policies and practices impact employees. And the G usually refers to regulatory and compliance obligations and how they're met. These days, in many cases, it's the S and the G part of ESG that are causing companies the most issues. Our guest today is the CPO of Aravo, which offers third-party management software that helps businesses manage risk. I'd like to welcome Dean Alms to our program. Hello, Dean.
Hello, thank you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Glad to have you with us and talk about this subject. To start off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and Aravo?
Sure. And given the audience, CPO at Aravo means Chief Product Officer, not Procurement Officer, which it often means in many supply chain organizations. So I am the Chief Product Officer for Aravo, and I've been in the company for a little over a year now. But I've been in enterprise software for 25 plus years, with the greater part of that being in software as a service. Before I started at Aravo, I didn't know that much about TPRM, but as I looked into it, I found this space extremely fascinating.
Yeah, well, it is obviously, and important, and increasingly importance these days. To kind of get into it, it seems to me that ESG, in most cases, represent good business practices, right? We hear that a lot with businesses, ESG, ESG. Um,
Yes.
but it's running into some political and public concerns these days, and we'll get into those a little bit. Both of which, though, create added risk for you. Kind of starting on the political side of this a little bit here, governments are increasingly getting involved with new regulations that are all designed to cut carbon emissions, et cetera. President Joe Biden has set a goal to make the U.S. a zero emissions economy no later than 2050. To get there, it's probably going to, let's be honest, require a lot of regulations, and that's going to be a significant lift for business. Can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing on the regulatory front, especially when we have regulations that are coming both from Washington and individual states such as California?
Yeah, absolutely, and certainly that is the case. And I think it's widely known that we're seeing more and more regulations around the umbrella term ESG. But actually, United States is actually trailing Europe, because you know the German. Supply Chain Act, and then there's other countries over there, and the European Union are taking on various initiatives as well. So, and then Canada more recently introduced legislation around this. So, United States, while it is a very hot topic, it is almost trailing the European Unions in terms of the amount of regulations that are underway to try to, to try to do more in helping companies, or not, basically helping companies understand what is expected of them going forward with their supply chain.
Yeah, and that's probably important to note too, because supply chains are global, right? And so
Absolutely.
you can match requirements in the United States, but you may not be meeting the requirements necessary in Germany or Europe or Asia, depending on what those may be. That creates this patchwork of regulations, right? That I have to believe has to be confusing for businesses.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What's the best way for business leaders to kind of stay up on top of all this? I mean, is it do you have to have somebody in place to manage it? Is there resources out there that you can get to?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Number one, a lot of the ways companies have responded to risk, ESG and other risk, whether it's ABAC or information security, data privacy, all of these various risks that have required the attention of organizations, especially with their supply chain. They basically need to look at this as a centralized discipline in some way, with a hybrid approach of getting other parts of the organization involved. Unfortunately, because these various risk domains have popped up over time, there is literally a patchwork of solutions within the enterprise as well. So IT will take on initiatives, procurement will take on initiatives, new sustainability organizations, and pretty soon you have very fragmented technologies trying to manage these risks almost independently, and that becomes a challenge unto itself because I don't get unified visibility into my risk exposure of working with an individual company because the various risk profiles are scattered about in different technologies.
So it's not just managing the regulations in the countries or the regions, but even within your own business
It is,
across
and
across
it's
the board.
and that's what we see more than anything else is companies that have been doing this for a while are turning to Aravo because we do work on providing that unified visibility across not only the ESG domains but ABAC and InfoSec and other areas that are equally important to these companies as they move forward.
Yeah,
But when going to your core question there about how do you stay on top of all these regulations, and it is difficult, and each individual company shouldn't try to tackle that themselves in terms of calling this information together. They should rely on their software providers, on other consulting organizations that are constantly monitoring that. If there is, I hate to bring up the AI term so early, but if there is one huge opportunity for AI, it is to monitor all of the regulations that are going on around the world, bring that to bear, so then you can assess whether that particular change in regulation or new regulation is going to impact your operations. But it is so frequent and so many changes that if we don't take it a little bit more seriously, we're just going to get caught off guard by something that a regulation that happened outside of our line of scope if we're not careful.
yeah. Technology has made that so much easier. Honestly, I have no idea how businesses in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, even the 70s, kind of kept track of this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Um, you
yeah,
the work that had to have gone into that to manage and monitor these things in all these strange places all around the world that
yeah.
many people haven't even heard of, but you're getting raw materials from or what have you. But
Yeah, I
um,
was in the HR software space for a while, and if you think about all of the taxes and all of the different HR type of regulations around the world, they kind of were the pioneers in having to deal with so many country by country, state by state, even city by city laws and things of that nature. And so there's something to be learned from how they tackled that, and the technology providers stepped up and made sure that companies were compliant with all of these different
yeah.
HR related regulations.
Yeah. So, yeah, shifting gears a little bit though, I want to move beyond regulations, which obviously is a big issue. We could do an entire podcast just on regulations
Absolutely.
for sure. But I want to touch on a couple of other topics. One of them is something that many businesses are running into this issue. And that is the push to make sure that your raw materials and products are being sourced from sustainable environments and socially responsible suppliers. This is not new, right? Child labor I mean, we've talked about child labor for decades, right?
Yes.
But let's be completely honest here. As Americans, we like cheap stuff, right? I mean, that's part of why manufacturing moved out of this country because it was cheaper to make it elsewhere. But that comes with costs, right? And now those costs are coming back to us, and we're realizing that some of those costs were cheaper because child labor was involved in some of these countries. So social media though has really put a spotlight, I think, on this, right? Because it's very easy now if somebody finds out about what a company is doing and blasts it out on social media, and then suddenly the company is in some trouble. Human rights are an issue, obviously. And these things are now front and center like they never have before. To give a couple of examples, for instance, U.S. based First Solar in August said that it did an independent review of its Malaysian operations and found that subcontractors were using unethical recruitment tactics and withheld pay from workers. Canada, the Canadian government this summer launched investigations into Walmart and Hugo Boss over allegations of forced labor in their supply chains. So this is a big issue for companies. It's not just big companies, small companies too. And in many cases, small companies. I think if Walmart is having this issue, right? What about
Mhm.
the smaller company that doesn't have the resources that Walmart has to kind of track this? So it's really a risk for these companies. And ESG is really about risk management anyway, in many ways. So I guess my question to you is: you speak with companies on a regular basis. Are these kind of incidents starting to get their attention? Is there legitimate concerns on their part that maybe they don't know where their sourcing is coming from, or things that they need to do to make sure that their sourcing is meeting these minimum standards at the very least?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the short answer is yes. They're very becoming increasingly aware of what is going on in their supply chain and the need to know whether they're have that complete visibility or not. They're making the investments to get that greater visibility into all their extended enterprise. Who is doing what, and what business practices are they using. So what is very clear is that companies, especially larger companies, are increasingly held accountable for the sins of their suppliers. It's not that they hired, slave labor, but if their companies that they bought from do that, then they're held accountable for it. And that accountability for what their suppliers are doing is clearly registering in the minds of the boardroom and the executive offices, and they need to make the investments accordingly.
Yeah. Are they doing enough from an investment standpoint? I mean, that's a very broad question, right? I mean, some companies are doing a lot, some maybe not so much. But I guess maybe as an industry, are we doing enough at this point to monitor this stuff, or is there more that needs to be done?
Yeah, I think, and once again, because of the way risk management has evolved with various pockets of risk. I mean, Aravo's been around for 20 years, so long before ESG became a term. We helped companies in terms of managing their supply chain and making sure human rights weren't violated, or whether environmental issues, whether it's waste management or responsible mining or forestry, all of those types of things we were working on with companies long before the ESG became a term. But as I mentioned before, it happened in a very fragmented way. So you had different technologies at play for managing different types of risk. And that creates a lot of redundancy issues because I need to know who are my suppliers and what am I buying from them. And there's a litany of risk I need to assess against those. If I'm doing that in a fragmented way, then I've got multiple databases of all my suppliers and all of the other related attributes associated with that suppliers, and that becomes a huge challenge for companies.
Yeah. Yeah, and supply chains are so complex these days. I mean, even when you think you might be buying from somebody, you may not be. Because they may
Exactly.
be outsourcing to somebody else on top of that. So,
Yeah.
I think data sharing, communication is probably really important in these steps as well. And
Yeah.
technology helps with that, obviously.
It is a relatively new discipline that is getting, like I said, more centralized focus, more need for unified visibility across all these risk domains. So there's still a way to go. And in the way we talk about it is third party risk management is not something you implement. It is a journey that takes time, and you're going through a process of a series of implementations based on the priorities of the organization. Some of our companies start with InfoSec, some start with ESG, some start with ABAC or anti-bribery and corruption. So all of these initiatives based on the priority of the organization, will come first, second, or third. But in many cases, what we say is think big about your overall third party management program, risk management program. Start small and then move aggressively in terms of tackling more and more of these solutions.
Yeah. Does that as companies look as far as where they're going to start and which area they're going to tackle first? Does the countries that they may be getting their suppliers are coming from, does that play a role in it? I mean, I imagine there's some countries that maybe bribery is a much greater concern, for instance. Um,
Yeah. I mean, it's countries, yeah, for sure. And, when it gets to the point where, we identify certain countries and you're like, okay, your risk factor is high just because you are working in that particular country. And sometimes it's an industry oriented things where anti bribery and anti corruption is more prevalent than other industries. And so there's a number of different attributes that we pull through a data collection process. And then we score those companies based on how they match up against that. And then they take whatever mitigation strategies they have to do. And it's not always, a clear cut. Sometimes you have to deal with a high risk company and continue to work with them because there are no other alternatives. And that's beyond an individual company decision. If I can only buy semiconductors from one part of the world, and I'm that concentrated risk there, I don't have a choice as an individual company until there's more places where I can buy certain supplies. I'm at the mercy of what the supply chain offers.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that kind of ties a little bit to my next question. to give throw a stat out there for people, we love data, right? So
Yeah.
from June 2022 to July 2023, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection detained over 1.75 billion dollars worth of products at ports due to concerns over their origin. Now, the number is a big number. The number of shipments in the grand scheme of things probably is not so much. That number represented a little over 5,000 shipments during that time frame. But I guess my concern here, what caught my attention was that they detained about 5,000 shipments, but they only released 2,000 ultimately. So 3,000 shipments were not released because they had concerns or they didn't believe that this stuff came from um, areas that it could be released into this country. And so I guess the question is that we've heard a lot about transparency, supplier transparency. So how does this keep happening? Like, why do these shipments keep getting delayed? Are we missing something here, or is this a case of companies just taking the risk?
Yeah, I think, as regulations get more and more teeth and government responses get more aggressive, these types of painful stories are really going to force companies to take this more seriously. And, it is going to impact their revenue streams and everything else. And so they have to take it more seriously and make the investments accordingly.
Mhm.
And, part of this is, I believe, personal opinion here, is because of what has happened to the U.S. manufacturing base over the last couple of decades. I think there is a significant number of manufacturers that feel that we operate under a different playing field than the rest of the world, especially over in Asia and China and things of that nature, because they tend to ignore some of the environmental and social issues that companies in the U.S. have to address. And as a result of that, I think U.S. government is saying we've got to level that playing field a little bit more, and we can't just look at the direct cost of what we're buying. We're going to force companies to look at those indirect costs, meaning the environmental impact, the social impact, those types of things when they make a buying decision, just so we can rebuild our manufacturing base. Now, once again, that is a very macro type of view of that. But if you think about it, if I only have to think about what I pay for the product and not worry about the indirect costs to social and environmental issues, then I'm going to continue to buy from countries that don't take that as seriously. So
Yeah,
I believe that's a big part of it.
yeah, and that ties in, I think, to some of what's happening in the supply chain, right? I mean, COVID forced companies, either because they had to or because now they've decided that this is a good idea, to diversify their supply chains, right? So we've seen a lot of
Yeah,
manufacturing shifted from
yeah,
China. Mexico is one area that a lot has gone to, but also a lot of other Asian countries. The That 1.75 billion dollars worth of products that was detained at ports that I mentioned a minute ago, over $1 billion of that came out of Malaysia. So clearly, it sounds like Malaysia is an issue, but yet there's a lot of manufacturing that's moving into Malaysia.
right.
So our visibility is not very good there.
Yeah, the
Maybe we can
infrastructure
improve
is
that.
not
Yeah,
there
yeah,
for that shift to occur, right? We shifted the manufacturing, but the visibility and the information that we need out of that is hasn't caught
right.
up yet.
Yeah, so I think I guess what I'm curious about is that as the companies look to diversify supply chains, because this seems to be a trend that's continuing, is going to continue for the next several years. Um, how do we continue to say, hey, ESG is really important. We have these goals. We're going to meet them. Um, but then we go into these areas where we don't have visibility, and now suddenly, while we're talking about ESG, we're not actually achieving it.
Yeah, and once again, I think I've talked to large energy companies and pharmaceutical financial services, and for them, whatever the political winds are a given time, whatever administration's in charge, they see ESG as a long term. Um, this is the way of the world, and it doesn't matter who's in charge at any given point in time. This is the way of the world, and so they're going to make investments to get there. Now, at any given point in time, there are definitely going to be some pain points. There's going to be some high frustrations and things of that nature. But I think directionally, it'll continue to move along this path just because, as you mentioned earlier, the social pressure from consumers that have access to all of these social media and
Yeah,
24-hour news, it is going to continue to um, cause companies to take step up and take notice of what they need to do along this front.
Yeah, I think social media has become such a an effort of change, for companies and what they do. And, it's so easy now for something to just get put on social media, true or not,
Yep.
to be honest, and then suddenly it's being seen by 300,000 people,
Right.
within hours. And, companies can be damaged badly by this. I mean, not just in ESG, but I mean, in a lot of areas, obviously. So, I mean, that's obviously a very a concern for companies these days. And ESG, part of that is, that ties into ESG a little bit too in the social. You don't want to become a negative viral sensation.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, and it often catches them off guard, and they're like, "Holy cow, we had no idea that this would explode the way it did." And so they just need to be mindful of it. And I think it relates to as much as ESG, it relates to greenwashing of trying to pretend that you're ESG compliant, and when you're really just marketing it. And that's what really gets consumers frustrated is pretending that you're environmentally sensitive or socially sensitive when it's a marketing ploy
Yeah.
versus an actual operational change.
Yeah. I just as an aside, I mean, if your company doesn't have a crisis communications plan in place, you really should have one.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
have connections to communications firms that can provide those, because I I guarantee you, of everybody listening today, 50% of them are going to need this at some point in the next couple of years,
yeah.
at least, and probably even higher than that.
I
So
totally agree. It is, that's, when we think about ESG, a lot of the times people think about the cost of complying, right? It's the operational cost of complying with these ESG regulations or initiatives and things of that nature. But the companies that do best with it are those companies that realize there is this need to avoid brand and financial liability as a result of ESG, as well as the need to protect revenue streams. And those companies that look at revenue streams and understand that, hey, if they're not doing this in the right way, they may lose a supplier that is essential to their overall revenue stream. Or
right.
if they work with the wrong company, they're going to have such brand damage, it is going to cost them enormous amounts of money to recover from that. So the cost of TPRM and compliance and building these systems to help them get visibility and control over this is fractional compared to some of these fines that companies face. I mean, we had one company, that turned to us afterwards, but they basically got fined over $100 million for an ABAC issue. They got fined four times that because they were negligent in terms of putting controls in place to make sure they were paying attention to ABAC issues. So it's really, it is the cost of those types of things and the potential revenue impact that is really should be their business motivations more than the actual cost of compliance.
Yeah, and in many ways, I think it ties back to that. What's the old saying that, like, pound was it pound wise penny? What is that? pound pound wise penny foolish or something? But
Exactly.
yeah, in essence, I mean, like, it may be cheaper to get some of this stuff, but if something goes wrong, it may cost you a lot more in the end than it would have cost you just to pay a little bit more
Yeah.
to do
And it
something.
just goes back to these larger companies and even medium-sized companies are being more and more held accountable for the sins of their suppliers. And so if you don't take that seriously, then you're going to be caught off guard and it may cost you more than you ever realized.
Yeah. You mentioned one customer there. I was wondering if you had a couple of examples you could share of how maybe some companies have gone on and achieved some of their goals, while maintaining profitability. Because I think that's a concern for many people. When you add anything, how does that impact the bottom line?
Yeah, I mean, the companies don't like to be named in this space for obvious reasons. So, we certainly work with consumer packaged goods companies, and a lot of them have elevated, they don't call it ESG as often, they call it their chief sustainability officer, right? And so they are looking at the supply chain from an overall sustainability perspective, and ESG falls underneath that, but so do other things. And so those are the companies that are doing the best with it because they see it as a competitive advantage, not as a compliance type of issue. And then there's other companies that whether it's ABAC or InfoSec, InfoSec is huge. It's probably one of the leading beachhead areas for managing your overall risk because you have data breaches and you have data privacy issues that once again can cost you enormous amounts of money. So those companies that go after that are really responding to what are the most urgent issues in their arena. For pharmaceutical and financial services, it really has to do with their regulatory environment. Both of those are heavily regulated, and there is no excuse for not having greater visibility and providing those reports, et cetera.
Yeah. And there's, as you talk about visibility, I mean, we could do a whole nother podcast obviously on how to achieve that and whatnot, and that's probably a
Yeah,
topic for another day. But you mentioned chief sustainability officers, and a lot of companies are adding those. But I wonder, are there enough companies that are elevating ESG type programs or risk management or chief sustainability officers, for instance, into their C-suite? Is that something? Do we need to have that because now this is becoming such an important thing? That
yeah.
if you
I think it's
don't have a representative there, do you need it?
Yeah, I think that's existed in pharma and financial services for a while under chief risk officers and things of that nature, just because of the nature of it. But certainly in consumer packaged goods, high tech, and things of that nature, you're definitely seeing an increased number of those types of roles insert themselves into the C suite, if you will. I think Lego, the toy company, just announced this week that they've hired a new chief sustainability officer. So, it is becoming, more and more prevalent across across various industries and around the world that companies, see this as essential to their overall business, as they should, because as we mentioned, the cost of liability and the impact on revenue streams is too significant to ignore.
Yeah. I want to get just one final question. Kind of sum this all up a little bit. We've touched on a lot of different things here, but when it comes down to it, ESG is really a risk management program. That's what it's ultimately about, right? It's risk management and business case, obviously. But you've got pressure from shareholders, from customers. We mentioned social media that can quickly turn into major headaches for companies. I think we all remember not necessarily an ESG issue, but the Budweiser situation from earlier this year, right? With
Yeah.
the trans influencer. Target had issues with some of their Pride merchandise. These things can quickly balloon out of control for companies. So as a company is trying to thread the needle and achieve ESG, meet its obligations, and manage the demands from the shareholders, the customers, et cetera. Can you close with any advice you might have for these companies? I mean, is there an easy way to kind of achieve this, or steps to get started on doing this?
Yeah, and I think I've alluded to it already in our conversation, which is, think take a bigger picture view. Even though you might have to start small with one particular area, take that bigger picture view of, hey, I've got to manage risk across a number of domains. So for us at Aravo, we have 14 different modules in the ESG arena alone, because some companies need to focus on, like I mentioned, waste management or water management, or how they deal with if they're in the forestry, get their supplies from the forestry industry or mining. All of these different domains, they need unified visibility across the board there. So think big, start small, and move aggressively based on your various risk profiles. I think, I'll date myself here, but if we turn the clock back to the 1980s, there was a major quality issue in manufacturing, and we were having a hard time competing with Japan and other companies at that time. And there was a lot of books written, and there's a lot of initiatives, but the book that stood out to me, or the concept that stood out to me at that time, was quality is free. If you invest in quality, you're going to get payback in terms of overall cost and greater revenue if you do the right thing. So quality is free. And in some ways, you could say the same thing for ESG. ESG is free if you think about what it means ultimately from a revenue perspective and from a financial liability and brand perspective. That investment is nowhere near what it would be if you ignore it. And that's the problem that companies have if they just take a compliance perspective. I need to comply with the German Supply Chain Act. I need to supply with California's, data privacy. If you take that perspective and look at it on a piecemeal basis, you're not going to get those the bigger benefits of going after this as a strategic initiative versus a compliance initiative.
They just end up being
They
costs.
just end up being costs. That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. We're out of time today. Unfortunately, it's very complicated times we're living in. I don't know how businesses do it honestly, and I think it's only going to get more complicated.
Yeah, I
And
couldn't agree more. It is not easy decisions, but it's we'll tackle it. We tend to step up to these things.
Yep. Well, I want to thank our guest today, Dean Alms. Pleasure having you with me today. Look forward to connecting with you again. Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on scmr.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Straight, and thank you for listening.